Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be continuing what we started yesterday and looking at the best case scenario for the Democratic Party in the upcoming 2026 midterm elections. Today's video is going to focus on the Senate and gubernatorial elections, and of course the Republican side of this, the best case scenario for the Republican Party. That'll be coming out on Thursday and on Friday. But before we get into this very quickly, I would ask everyone to go vote in this poll I put on the channel. I'm asking you whether or not you would like a new series, so go make your voice heard. Right now, it seems as though the community would like a series, but it's early, and I think only around like 150 votes have been cast. So go ahead and it's all democracy here. So go make your voice heard. Tell me what you want to see. Let's begin. So this is what I think, and this is going to be a bit harder than the House map because these races are bigger, they're more important, and I don't want to say there's more room for variance, but I think people have stronger opinions about these races, and I know a lot of people are going to be not happy with me for not having Texas or Ohio in the Democratic column. The argument's going to be, in a best case scenario for the Democratic Party, they could win Ohio or they could win Texas, and I'm not so sure I agree with that, especially at the Senate level. So we'll start in Texas and Ohio. Actually, we're just going to do Texas individually because I want to explain why I don't think these states are really in play for Democrats. And I think Texas is interesting because Democrats have a good nominee in Colin Allred. The Republicans might nominate a pretty bad candidate in Ken Paxton. But nonetheless, what we saw the last time the seat was up was that it wasn't competitive. Now, again, you might say, well, hold on. John Cornyn, who's the incumbent, might lose his primary to Ken Paxton. And if that happens, which is definitely possible, Democrats could this could look a lot different. But in 2020, Texas is a bluer state than it was right now. The thing people don't understand about Texas is that it is a really, like geographically, this is a really big and diverse state, right? Like look at the Rio Grande Valley. This is an area that was blue even in 2020. It's pretty red nowadays. And again, this is mostly rural Hispanic voters who have really trended away from the Democratic Party in pretty staggering numbers. And then you look at the Dallas suburbs. Kamala Harris did a little bit better than the Democratic nominee MJ Hagar did in 2020 in these suburbs, but they're still not blue enough to compensate for the fact that Democrats have lost a ton of support in the southern part of the state, and also the fact that Democrats have not gotten good turnout out of Houston the past few cycles. They haven't gotten where they needed to be in San Antonio or Austin because the trends here have kind of stagnated. So, like individually, in 2026, Democrats might have a really good night in the Dallas suburbs, but they also might not have a good enough night in the Rio Grande Valley or in downtown Houston. And so what that means is that you're probably dealing with a situation where Democrats can get within 4 or 5 points of winning here. Maybe they actually do have maybe Colin Alexis does have a really good performance in this state. But overall, just kind of being realistic here, I would certainly argue that Texas for now, just based on the coalitions, seems out of reach for the for the Democratic Party. And mind you, right, like this isn't me saying it's unwinnable for Democrats forever, but until something changes, there's just, the votes aren't there. And then Ohio's kind of interesting because it's they didn't have a Senate race actually. But Ohio's interesting because if we just pull up a map here, I wonder if they had, no, they're not going to have it. But if we just pull up a map here, this is the last governor's election in Ohio, or actually we can look at the last Senate election, which was actually not the last Senate election, but a Senate election we can look at, which shows a pretty somewhat competitive election. Ohio is interesting because Democrats do not do well here anymore. This is the Mahoning Valley, and if you are interested in the politics of the Rust Belt and why Democrats have lost support here, why Republicans are now winning these states, look at these parts of states like Ohio, which Obama won by like 25 to 30 points and are now voting for Republicans like J.D. Vance and like Bernie Moreno. And so the GOP, obviously, this is the J.D. Vance seat. J.D. Vance is now the vice president, so the GOP chose Jon Husted to fill this seat, and he is now running for re-election in 2026. He's a fine incumbent. He's pretty low profile, doesn't have a lot of scandals, is certainly someone that I think, is good enough to win a statewide race in Ohio. And Democrats might hope Sherrod Brown runs for Senate. I think it's more likely he runs for governor. So maybe it's competitive, but I think Ohio is especially a long shot in the Senate for Democrats. So what does that mean? A couple seats worth highlighting that I think Democrats are already competitive in. North Carolina, Roy Cooper, the former governor. A lot of people believe he's going to run. This is an open seat in a Trump plus 3 state. The GOP won the seat by less than 2% last time it was up. That's definitely winnable for Democrats. And then they have an incumbent in Georgia, Jon Ossoff, who in 2020 knocked out GOP Senator David Perdue. And the Republicans hope to run Brian Kemp against John Ossoff, and Brian Kemp has announced he's not running. So Ossoff, I think, is outright favored right now. In a best case scenario, he'd absolutely win. And then finally, I think we're getting into the, not a safer seat, but one that Democrats should realistically be winning is Michigan, where Gary Peters, the incumbent Democrat, is retiring, but Republicans seem likely to run Mike Rogers again. So, again, it's a state that voted for Trump, but it has two Democratic senators, and Democrats have had a pretty good streak in recent Senate elections, even though in 2024, I will say, it was very close. So the the more reach-y states, I guess you could say, for Democrats are Maine, Iowa, and Alaska. And I think these are the states that they would only win on a good night. Maine's the easiest just in terms of partisanship. This is a state, right, that Kamala Harris won by, I think, 8% in 2024, so or maybe even 9%. So it's definitely like the partisanship is there for Democrats. This is a blue state. But if you remember 2020, Susan Collins surprised a lot of people, including myself, by winning re-election. She won by around 7.5 points when it was all said and done. And again, there's definitely some ranked choice voting that needed to happen here. Like Maine in 2020 was the first election they had ranked choice voting, so a lot of people voted for Lisa Savage, and Savage publicly said they should rank Gideon second. So, I think if you did a ranked choice voting of this, Collins would have won by like 5 instead of 8, maybe 4 instead of 8. But like that being said, it wasn't really all that. It wasn't all that important. She got a majority in the first round, anyways. And what you can see here is that even though Collins lost some support compared to her previous runs in like the southern part of Maine, she did really well. She was able to, do I think 18% better than Donald Trump. And despite the fact that she, for the past few years, has not really had good approval ratings, has been kind of an underdog, she won. She's been winning. And in 2020 that happened. I think it's going to happen again in 2026. But on a good night for Democrats, maybe her unpopularity finally costs her. Democrats run a better campaign they ran in 2020, and polarization sets in a little bit, and Maine's partisanship says, hey, look, this is a Democratic state. Susan Collins has been senator here for 5 terms. Maybe we're going to switch it up. So it's definitely possible. It just isn't. I think it's a tougher lift than people realize. And then the last 2 states are big reaches, which are Iowa and Alaska. Iowa is interesting because the last time we had a midterm election with Trump as president, it really swung to the left. Democrats did 14% better in the House popular vote in 2018 they did in the preceding year, 2016. And they flipped 2 House seats, and they nearly won the governorship as well. So Iowa, to me, is kind of the perfect example of like a state where if like I guess there's a lot of room for like multiple outcomes to occur, which is why Democrats still have like a very, very, very narrow path to victory here. And it kind of looks like this. Joni Ernst, who's the GOP incumbent on your screen right now, won by 7% in 2020. She's now likely to retire, it seems. If she wins free election, I still think she's somewhat vulnerable because she's made a couple of comments that have really upset people, like the Medicare comment, which Democrats are absolutely going to run on next year. And Democrats seem likely to run J.D. Scholten, who is a former House candidate who's overperformed a couple of times. I don't think he's a great candidate, but he's run decent campaigns before, so he's not like, he's, I think, better than any candidate they've run in the past few Senate elections. And overall, this is a state that, right, like, if you're a big believer in Trump's tariffs actually hurting people, if you're a big believer in, just like the trade stuff with China, especially, farmers get hurt by that. At least I guess that's kind of how the argument goes. So, I'm not saying it's going to flip, but I think maybe if people are angry at Trump, then we realize Iowa would be in play. And then Alaska would be tilt Democratic on the sole condition that Mary Peltola runs. Peltola was the former representative of this House seat. She's won statewide before. She lost in 2024 very narrowly, but she did like 13% better than Kamala Harris. And Dan Sullivan is a decent incumbent, but kind of has, I would say lower name recognition than other senators, like in Alaska, especially someone like Lisa Murkowski. So that's the Senate map. Democrats would win the majority in their absolute best case scenario, but I don't believe that, I think a lot of these states like Texas and Ohio are definitely heavier lifts. So with that, we're going to go on to the governor's map, where, again, like we have a couple of competitive races. I don't really see as many reaches here. The one that might stick out to you is Nevada, which, again, you might be thinking like, this is a Trump plus 2.5 state. It's supposed to be competitive. Democrats won a Senate race here last year. Why, in their best case scenario, would they not be winning the governorship? Especially because if you go back to 2022, it was actually a very narrow result. Let's see if I can pull it up here. It was a very narrow result with Joe Lombardo beating Steve Sisolak by like only 15,000 votes. And my answer to that is that Joe Lombardo seems to be quite popular. His approval ratings are around 60% in most polls, and in 2022, he outran Adam Laxalt by around 3%. It was nearly 3%, which is significant, especially because it was his first time running statewide. And he just, to me, he seems as though he's kind of not really bipartisan, but has a reasonable approval rating among Democrats. He's kind of distanced himself from like Trump, and that isn't to say that he's like a moderate, never Trump Republican, but he's kind of just kept a low profile. And we know the rule of thumb here, which is that incumbent governors who are at least decently popular almost rarely lose re-election. Steve Sisolak was the only sitting governor to lose re-election in 2022, and he was less popular than Joe Lombardo. So I believe Lombardo is actually going to probably coast to re-election, which might surprise some people, but I'm kind of calling it now. And then most of these are pretty self-explanatory. Democrats have incumbents in Arizona and Wisconsin. Michigan's an open seat, but it's been left to the nation. It's been left to the nation the past few cycles, or it was left to the nation in 2024. Excuse me, it trended left to the nation in 2024. My apologies. And Democrats did really well here in the 2022 governor's race. I don't think they'll win by as much this time, but I do expect them to hold this seat. And in a best case scenario, I think they'd win it by like 5, maybe even more, but I'm being conservative. So then the really only ones you have to talk about here would be Alaska, Georgia, and Ohio. Alaska is definitely the weirdest one here because, like, if you look at what happened here in 2022, it was a really interesting, it was kind of a 3-way race between former Governor Bill Walker, Democrat Les Guerra, and then Mike Dunleavy. And Dunleavy only got 50% of the vote. It wasn't like he, had a decisive mandate. And Guerra and Walker, who are both kind of, Bill Walker was kind of more of a Democrat than a Republican. They both, they combined for like 45% of the vote. So I think if Democrats contest this race, maybe they run Peltola. Again, Peltola can't run for governor and Senate, but we're saying like best case scenario on each individual map. It could be competitive, but it's just one worth throwing out there kind of for fun. And then Ohio and Georgia, there's a bit more of a path. Georgia Democrats have a problem in the sense they don't really have a great candidate to run. The good news for them is that the incumbent Republican Brian Kemp is not running for re-election. Brian Kemp was quite popular. He actually gained some legitimacy among Democratic voters, especially in the Atlanta suburbs, because of his efforts kind of against President Trump to overturn the 2020 election. So I think that kind of helped his electability. And what I would say is that Democrats need to find a good candidate here. I think if they were to run Stacey Abrams again, they'd probably lose. So if they can find someone better, it's this is a state that's been trending left. I think Democrats are favored to win the Senate race there as of right now. And overall, I would argue that I'd argue that in a like generic Democrat versus generic Republican race, this could be very close either way. And then finally, the last state we're going to kind of dive into would be Ohio. Ohio, I don't really have any reason to not give it to Democrats. Trump did win it by 11%, and I talked about how the Senate race is a bit tougher of a lift, but the Republicans seem to have a worse candidate there. It's likely that they're going to nominate, obviously, former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy for governor, and Ramaswamy is definitely a controversial figure. Would be the most right-wing figure that Republicans have nominated at the top of the ticket in Ohio in a very long time. I think he's more right-wing than J.D. Vance, at least in terms of rhetoric. And J.D. Vance in 2022 didn't do all that great. He only won by 6% in a year where the GOP won the national popular vote by over 2. So Ohio was like less than 4% to the right of the country in 2022 when you had a good Democratic candidate running against a pretty weak Republican candidate. If the national popular vote is like D+5 or D+6, you could absolutely see the same thing happening, except Democrats didn't narrowly win the seat or win the governorship. Sherrod Brown might run. He's absolutely the Democratic Party's best nominee. If he runs, the race becomes somewhat competitive at the very least. In a really good scenario for Democrats, yes, you'll beat Vivek Ramaswamy by like 20,000 votes or something like that. So that's what I have to say about the Democratic Party's best case scenario. They'd be winning basically every swing state governorship except for Nevada, and they'd be maybe going into red states like Ohio and Alaska. Then in the Senate, Iowa, Alaska, Maine, North Carolina will be flipping. Democrats have to hold on to Michigan and Georgia as well. I still think Ohio and Texas are out of reach. I'll keep considering that, and I'll adjust that opinion if I see fit as we get close to 2026, but for now, that's where I'm at. And of course, go vote in this poll. That's the most important thing for you to do. So let me know what you want to see next. Let me know what, again, just what you think about these maps in general. And I'll see you all next time.